Good afternoon. Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to a packed Oxford Martin School. We're very pleased to welcome Carl Frey tonight, a long-standing member of the school. He's Oxford Martin City Fellow, Director of the Oxford Martin Programme on the Future of Work, and he's the Dieter Schwarz Associate Professor of AI and Work at the Internet Institute here. Also a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Back in 2013, Carl co-authored what became an extremely influential paper, The Future of Employment, How Susceptible Are Jobs to Computerization. This became one of the most widely cited papers on automation, with, staggeringly, over 19,000 citations. The study's methodology has subsequently been used by, among others, Barack Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, the Bank of England, and the World Bank. Since then, Carl has served as an advisor and consultant to international organizations, think tanks, government, and business, and his academic work has featured in over 100 media outlets. How Progress Ends is Carl's second book, much of it written in this building, in an office just above this gallery here. It has just been shortlisted for the very prestigious FT and Schroeder's Best Business Book of the Year. We wish him luck in that competition and are delighted to hear more about the book's arguments this evening. So lastly, before I hand over to Carl, I would like to just tell you that the talk is being filmed and recorded. So in the Q&A session, which Carl will handle himself, just be aware that that is happening and don't ask a question if you don't want to be filmed. So, Carl.
Thank you very much, Julian, for that very warm and generous introduction. I have no way of living up to the expectations, but I'll do my best. The book is not quite as pessimistic as the title might sound. It's not suggesting that progress is inevitably about to come to an end. But what it does suggest is that there is nothing inevitable about technological progress, trying to push back a little bit against this narrative coming out of Silicon Valley in particular. Because if progress was inevitable, why did it take us 200,000 years to have an industrial revolution? If progress is inevitable, why aren't most societies rich and prosperous? If progress is inevitable, why have technology leaders like Britain seen stagnation over the past few decades? And so I'm not suggesting that that is going to continue to be the case, but what I hope is to provide a framework for thinking about these issues. Now, I'm obviously not the first person to write a book about the wealth and poverty of nations. And so let me start off by situating the book a little bit in the literature, which I'm not going to do justice by any means, but at least I can provide a little bit of a straw man or a caricature to pitch my book against, right? And so there are three broad explanations, or buckets of explanations for why some places are rich and some are poor. And the trouble with all of them is that they can't really explain why some places have seen impressive growth spurts followed by stagnation or even collapse, as the case of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's geography, when it grew rapidly in the 1950s, was the same as it was in the 1980s. That was most certainly fixed. The culture, which many have pointed out being important to progress and innovation, if anything, became more open to science and progress in the later years. There was no amount of barbed wire that could prevent the radio and television waves from Western Europe traveling right through the Iron Curtain. And obviously, Gorbachev's reform with the glasnost were encouraging more public and intellectual debate and discourse. Nor did the Soviet Union have anything like secure private property rights. And if anything, the reforms with perestroika, which gave firms more autonomy, you would think should have led to an uptick in economic growth in the Soviet Union. And so why do we see this cycle of rapid growth followed by stagnation? Well, the point I'm trying to make in the book is that the Soviet Union was pretty good at catch-up growth. And so it took ample opportunity of, for example, the Ford Motor Company's open door policy, used that to build an automotive industry in the Soviet Union, and it did pretty well at mobilizing resources and pushing them towards key and priority sectors. It also did pretty well in delivering some spectacular firsts like Sputnik, but that was mostly in the military domain where it was exposed to very fierce competition. But as the mass production system petered out in the 1970s, something new was needed for continued growth, and that something new was the computer, to which Soviet contributions were essentially none. Some people, like Oscar Lange, predicted at the time that computers would aid central planning, that it would bolster the Soviet model. But what you actually see is that it did the opposite, because in the age of mass production, Soviet authorities could benchmark performance across factories and so hold factory managers accountable. But when something is new, when a new technology is being adopted, benchmarking is much harder, and so it becomes much harder to hold people accountable through monitoring. And so what the Soviet Union needed to push the boundaries in computing was greater decentralization. Centralization can work quite well for catching up, for mobilizing resources, but at the technological frontier, it doesn't do as well. If you were an aircraft engineer in the Soviet Union, for example, you could go to the Red Army and ask for funding. If they declined, maybe you had 2 or 3 different options. If they declined, your idea would die with you. Conversely, consider Bessemer Ventures' failure to invest in Google back in 1999. They probably regret it these days, but it also illustrates that Google was by no means a safe bet at the time. Alta Vista and Yahoo were dominating search. And so to figure out what will catch on, somebody needs to take the risk of investing, and the virtue of decentralization is that you can take more different bets. And the fact that Bessemer Venture didn't invest didn't mean that Google couldn't proceed and succeed, because others took the risk of investing. Now, the argument I'm making is not so much one of private versus public financing, right? And so, Apollo, Manhattan, the Red Lab, they all achieved their objectives of delivering the bomb, of advancing radar technology, of putting a man on the moon, but they built on previous exploration, and they were backed by public funds. But so was ARPA, which advanced ARPANET. But there was certainly no plan with that to develop the modern internet. Licklider had done much of his seminal work already. He was granted considerable autonomy by ARPA, which functioned as a very decentralized organization and drew also upon a decentralized network of universities. And so you wouldn't say that that was by any means planned. It's not the same thing as, let's say, the Apollo project. Now, the Soviet Union might be an extreme case, but the post-war period, broadly speaking, saw very rapid growth by both historical and modern standard. It was very broad-based, saw it in the United States, in the Soviet Union, on the European periphery, and in Western Europe. And what European economists, which closed the gap to the United States in this period, despite very rapid growth in the US as well, what they had in common is that they employed various approaches to planning. In France, the Monnet Plan created a concerted economy. In Italy, ERI, as a state holding company, coordinated investment across sectors. In Spain, INI did the same thing, and no place did coordinated capitalism more successfully than Japan, which many at the time predicted would also overtake the United States. Back in 1990, PBS Frontline ran a documentary titled Losing the War to Japan, in which Chalmers Johnson remarks that the Cold War is over and Japan won. And there was a widespread sense of, at the time, that what Japan had already done in cars, with Toyota overtaking General Motors and Ford, was now also happening in semiconductors, consumer electronics, and in a range of industries. And while the American occupation authorities had tried to impose an American competition regime on Japan as World War II came to an end, those laws were rarely enforced, and the Zaibatsu conglomerates, which had existed before, quickly morphed into keiretsu conglomerates, which, quite as in Europe, coordinated investment, traded among each other, were quite successful in diffusing technology and scaling, but erected very significant barriers to entry for new firms to enter. And so Japan did very well when it came to catch-up growth. Again, it did less well at the technological frontier. Now, Japanese stagnation is worthy of a book in itself, and I don't want to oversell the point that it's all about technology. But it's certainly fair to say that Japan missed the transition from hardware to software. And it's also fair to say that the more vigorous competition regime in the United States contributed to that as well. So the antitrust suit against IBM forced it to unbundle hardware and software. It permitted new firms like Microsoft to enter the market. The breakup of AT&T didn't just lead to an upsurge in patenting by new firms. It also meant that when the National Science Foundation released ARPANET to the world, the technology wasn't just handed over to an existing monopolist whose boardroom could essentially bottleneck the technology if it saw no immediate commercial use for it. And so the consequence of that was in large part that the internet could develop more organically by its users and by new firms building products and services around it. And thirdly, and no less importantly, the US actually pivoted and proved much more flexible when it came to devising global supply chains, which would not have been possible without the computer revolution. There's no way that firms could have managed production at distance without ICT technology. And this really helped and aided integration with China and essentially undercut the Japanese production advantage at the time. Integration with China is getting a lot of bad press these days, but in large part it was actually a response to US firms being outcompeted by on the production side by Japanese firms. Now, a key question is obviously why China? And I'm not going to answer that question in full, but I think it's helpful to contrast the Chinese model with that of the Soviet Union, because Gorbachev, as I mentioned earlier, tried to introduce some liberalizing reforms as well, which mostly failed. And a key reason for that is that in the Soviet Union, basically every industry from railroads to steel were managed by vertical ministries from Moscow. That's quite different to the Chinese case, where provinces and counties had much more autonomy and could experiment with different policies as China began to liberalize. And so you did not have to pull the rug under the entire system. Different provinces could pursue different policies in China with different effects. And what the CCP retained, though, is control over personnel. It could set the targets that provinces ought to pursue, which was mostly growth. And then it could promote those provincial governors that did well and not promote the ones that did not do as well. And I think a common misconception about China is that much of the catch-up has been engineered from Beijing. In actual fact, on the national level, industrial policy is a relatively recent phenomenon, right? So it basically takes off in 2006. And most industrial policy for then, as Philippe Aghion, who won the Nobel Prize this week, and co-authors have shown, was actually pro-competitive in the sense that it created more competition by local authorities supporting local firms and having them compete with each other in China. Now, this model of what Branko Milanovic have called political capitalism worked quite well as long as you could set clear objectives, whether that was growth, whether that was foreign direct investment, whether that was something else. But at the technological frontier, it's harder to measure performance. One approach has been rewarding more patents, but that, in the case of China, has led to the filing of a lot of junk patents which don't cover particularly valuable technologies. And as you see, firms often don't even pay renewal fees to maintain those patents, which tells you something. And at the same time, in recent years, we've seen authorities in Beijing pivoting more towards centralization once more. Under the banner of common prosperity, there's been a clampdown on technology firms. The CCP has taken stake in a wide range of technology companies directly as a means of controlling them. And because it's hard to instrumentalize firms for political objectives, state-owned enterprises are once again becoming more prominent in the Chinese economy. And all of this has been a drag on growth. China has been able to continue to grow through construction, but productivity over the past decades has been very disappointing and even negative by some estimates. And so the Chinese model, it seems, is beginning to run out of steam. And again, in some ways, China is not that different from any other place. If you look at the firms that are most inventive, it's private firms, it's particularly foreign invested firms, and some startups like DeepSeek, they can be permitted to fly under the radar as long as they serve national objectives. But those objectives can shift quite quickly, which means that you better build up some political capital to have a seat at the table when priorities change, and that diverts resources from innovation to political capital. Now, China is not the only place that is not doing too well. And if we look across advanced economies, we are seeing a productivity slowdown of global nature. And we're seeing it even in the United States, where that T-boom essentially petered out in 2004. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of growth in Europe has essentially depended on catch-up growth with the United States. And so it's not too surprising that Europe has also slowed down as the United States has slowed down. What's perhaps more surprising is that while European firms caught up with the frontier in mass production industries, they haven't really caught up in digital yet, but maybe that is a question for the Q&A. One point that I make in the book is that one of the key virtues of the United States in driving technological progress has been its relative dynamism. So if you take the 5 largest firms by market cap in the US, they are on average 39 years old. If you do the same exercise for other advanced economies like France and Germany, they're 100 plus years old. In France, they're mostly in luxury goods. In Germany, they're mostly firms of the second industrial revolution. An exception to that is SAP, which was founded by 5 former employees from IBM back in the 1970s. But that dynamism cannot be taken for granted. And in tandem with this slowdown in productivity, we've seen a slowdown in dynamism in the US as well, whether it's through measures like reshuffling of market share, whether it's through entry and exit of firms, even in the technology sector. And there are various explanations for this, but there's a growing body of work suggesting that it has to do with lobbying, with incumbents lobbying increasingly for protective regulation, and incumbents employing a relatively wide range of anti-competitive practices, whether it's the revolving door between the US Patent and Trademark Office, whereby examiners grant low quality patents to incumbents and are later employed by them, or whether it's by killer acquisitions, whereby incumbents essentially buy up promising startups only to shut them down. And the result of this has been more inventive talent clustering in incumbents. And so a greater and greater share of the inventive workforce is being employed by a few companies. Now, is this bad or not? Well, that's exactly the question being asked in this paper. And what it shows is that, well, you can certainly argue that many of these incumbents do some innovation, but you shouldn't be too surprised that the place does some innovation if it's employing a lot of inventive talent. And that inventive talent we see is less productive among these incumbents than it was in the younger firms where they previously worked. And so this is having a negative impact on the inventive capacity of the US economy. Now, a key question which I grapple a little bit, at least, with in the book is, can AI reverse this trend? And I think the answer really depends on how we use it and whether we can restore competition. So not so long ago, there was a narrative out there that if you just scale up existing models, you throw more compute and data at the problem, you get better performance. And many of you will have seen that various foundation models pass this test and that test, etc. But that's much more impressive if they didn't actually have the answers to those questions in the training data, right? And so there's been various tests to try to look at how well AI actually performs on novel problems which are super easy to any human. And so ARC-AGI is one such benchmark. And what it shows is that on tests where humans will get 100%, even the best models don't score better than 15%. And in fact, even in domains where we have achieved superhuman performance, humans have sometimes mounted astounding comebacks. So most of you will have heard about AlphaGo beating the world champion back in 2016. Fewer of you will probably have heard that human amateurs, with the help of standard laptops, exposing the best open source Go programs to positions and concepts that they would not have encountered in training, beat these programs quite easily. And so this raises, I think, fundamental questions of, can we really trust these tools when circumstances change? So if the world was just a static distribution of events, we should probably brute force it. But it's not like it's changing all the time. And so we, I think, need more robust AI that can deal with changing circumstances and also learn through experience the way humans do. I think this is quite profound implications for the capacity of AI to help us in innovation and in scientific discovery. So imagine you've trained a model on everything that has been published up until 1900, and you ask it, will humans ever been able to fly? It would have access to a long list of failed trials. It might look to data on birds as evidence that human flight might be possible in principle, but even so, it would conclude that there is no bird that weighs more than 30 pounds that is able to get off the ground. Larger birds like ostriches don't fly. And so, by all likelihood, this model will never have concluded that human flight is going to be possible. And more profoundly, LLMs essentially imitate human behavior. They don't learn through experience, through trial and error, the same we do. And that's, broadly speaking, how we invent. And so I think that some of the old rules still apply. One is that when a technology is new, decentralization is important, both within firms and in terms of entry. And so one of the reasons why US firms did better in terms of productivity during the computer revolution was that they were more decentralized. People at the lower levels of an organization had more decision-making autonomy. That meant that the people that actually experimented with the new technology had some say in terms of making decisions. Those lessons, I would argue, still apply with AI, and we do have some evidence actually already to show that firms adopting AI tend to become less hierarchical, not more hierarchical. Second point, which I think is regularly being missed, and one reason why entry is so important, is that large firms have scale. And because they have scale, they're more likely to invest in process innovation and automation to try to bring down costs in what they already do. Smaller firms, younger firms, they don't have scale, and they're more likely to invent new products and pursue new lines of industry. And if you think about it, if everything that we have done since 1800 was automation, we would have productive agriculture and cheap textiles, but with some exaggeration, that would basically be it, right? We wouldn't have vaccines, antibiotics, airplanes, rockets, computers, right? Most growth and most increases in material standards come from doing new and previously inconceivable things. And one reason why growth was so rapid in the post-war period was that we created new and very large-scale industries. The automotive industry was the largest industrial enterprise that had ever existed, and that is not to mention the variety of industries producing the components that go into making a car, not to mention the industries producing the machine tools that are needed to make the components, not to mention the rise of road commerce and tourism that came with the automobile, not to mention all the electrical industries that emerged as well. Basically every gadget you have in your home is an artifact of this era, and there was an industry behind it. And that's quite different from the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, which centered on textile mechanization. It's only really later on with steam that's being applied to transportation in terms of railroads and steamships that you actually see productivity take off. And it's quite different from what we've seen with digital and robotics, which is more about increasing efficiency, I would argue, in things that we're already doing. And so the US grew very rapidly in the post-war period because it also divides the institutions to support the rollouts of these industries, like through the Highway Act in particular. But there was also a very different institutional framework underpinning the development of these technologies, which were invented in the 19th century, where 85% were independent inventors and where most technologies were traded in a vibrant marketplace for technology. Early corporations, whether it's AT&T or even DuPont, their R&D department, they just consisted of a bunch of people screening patents. They didn't have an internal workforce to even develop any new technologies themselves. And so the exploration phase is quite different from the exploitation phase, but I think competition is important to both of them. And I discuss a little bit about this in the book, but in the 19th century, there was a lot of concern in Britain, who was the technology leader at the time, that Germany was closing the gap and was even overtaking Britain. And it was in some industries, but not yet on the aggregate. Germany and France actually only overtakes Britain in the post-war period. And there are two things that I think are important here. First of all, a large part of British manufacturing industry is cartelized in this period, so domestic competition is weak. And then Britain was left outside the European Economic Community until 1973, and so competition from abroad was weak too. And we're seeing essentially the same thing happening in the United States as well right now, with tariff barriers coming up, less domestic competition. And I'm not going to predict the decline of the United States, but I do want to remind you that nothing lasts forever. So on that cheerful note, I've probably spoken longer than I should, and happy to take any questions and comments and even criticism. After all, we are a university. Thank you. Awkward silence. No questions. I think we have a microphone coming.
I'm interested in asking an elaboration on the slide where you showed the Sputnik and the Russian model, and now talking about China and the similarities and the differences. China very recently had one of its largest military parades. You put on the slideshow DeepSeek as well, and it's pushing for AI. It's pushing therefore military and technology with a very different system. Can you see any similarities with the rise and decline in the USSR with the very big military and very big technological push? What are the differences there?
So the USSR was highly militarized even after World War II, and even became more militarized with the Korean War. And there's been a long debate whether the Soviet Union stagnated because it was pushing so many resources into defense industries. But I think the consensus view is that that is not enough to account for the growth slowdown in the USSR. And so in that case, I don't think that story really fits. I haven't seen anybody trying to do the same thing for China, but I very much doubt that productivity coming into negative territory and Chinese growth essentially stagnating at much, much lower levels than what you see in Korea, Japan, or Taiwan is mainly due to the military sector. And so part of it is down to misallocation, part of it is essentially down to real estate sector, which is a third of GDP. And I think part of it is down to policies which don't prioritize growth to the same degree any longer. And I think many of the industrial policy initiatives over the past decade or so, it might be too early also to evaluate them. So I don't want to say that made in China 2020 is doomed to fail. And it's quite different from what Korea and Japan was doing in terms of trying to drive catch-up. China is essentially trying to leapfrog. But I do worry that in a system where political connection matters a lot and where you have very little accountability throughout the innovation process, that a lot of those resources will be wasted. I think even people that are more optimistic than I am will agree that a lot of it is going to be wasted, but they will say that it's still much better when having some waste, but you still develop some valuable technology. And of course, we waste a lot of resources in private venture capital as well, hoping that a few things will take off. But I would argue that industry is less based on political connection. The connections certainly matter there too. we have some questions over there.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question to the AI section of the talk with regards to kind of whether AI is a productivity enhancing technology. The benchmark you showed, ArcAGI2, is kind of an IQ test for like very close to a visual reasoning test, which you tend not to be paid a lot of money to do. I was curious as which kinds of tasks, benchmarks for AI systems would kind of provide signal to whether they can increase, like do economically valuable tasks apart from these visual reasoning tests?
Yeah, so if I understand your question correctly, you're sort of looking for new benchmarks, and I don't know exactly what those benchmarks should be, but they should be about AI actually doing valuable work in the real economy and having an impact on that, and not some, artificial benchmark of human performance in a setting which has no economic value. So I think the direction of travel there should be, on this benchmark, can AI actually do valuable work? I think Cameron probably had a killer question here.
Thanks, Carl, for a super thought-provoking talk. I enjoyed it. And it's good to see you're still thinking about the very big questions. I just wanted to sort of try and work out where you fit between, on the one hand, Robert Gordon with the end of growth, and on the other hand, Marty Weitzman, say, with combinatorial growth, the idea that the more ideas you have, the more ideas you can have. In Marty's case, with Robert's view, we've had all the big ideas. Both of them go to the potential for continued growth. I know your talk was about progress rather than growth. There's, of course, an important distinction between those two things we don't dwell on right now. But your point is progress is not inevitable. Perhaps growth is not inevitable. But where do you come down? What do you think is more likely? And are there levers we can pull to send the global economy in a direction of greater prosperity?
Well, two very big questions. So, first of all, I don't quite think that all great things have been invented and that the inventions of the 19th century, which were exploited in the 20th century, cannot be repeated. Nor, does sort of combinatorial growth quite fit sort of the story with the internet, which, should have created a huge acceleration in progress and didn't quite do so. And so I guess where I come down is that, there are real bottlenecks there, right? And so even if AI turns out to be a hugely useful tool in medical discovery, you still need to go through clinical trials, and that's usually expensive, and you still need to partner with a pharmaceutical company in order to do that. And that means that you will have, a lot of market concentration, a couple of firms with a lot of power. The clinical trials themselves, unless they are significantly streamlined or deregulated some way, you're still going to have that bottleneck, even if AI turns out to be a really useful tool. And to me, it's still, really beyond me, right? It's hard to think about something more transformative than a personal computer and an internet, in particular for research, right? So gives us, the world's stored knowledge in our pockets, connects some of the best talent around the world, aids the research process itself enormously. And the studies we have seem to suggest a decline in research productivity and a decline in breakthrough innovation. And why is that? Are we sort of rewarding the wrong things? So there was a paper that came out recently that suggested that the more projects you have at any given point in time, the less likely you are to make a truly foundational discovery. And clearly you can use these tools to do more things, or you can use them to dig deeper into one thing. But if I thought that I had a really great idea, and but it may take me 10 or 20 years to get there, people will start asking me, Carl, what are you doing? You haven't published anything, for 10 years, and you're just working on this thing. And I thought it was inspiring to read about Kathleen Carrico, who won the Nobel Prize recently, and she got demoted or didn't get tenure and still persisted, and mRNA vaccines are a result of that. And so maybe our reward systems are more towards quantity rather than quality and breakthroughs, and maybe we have some institutional bottlenecks that mean that some researchers are spending 40% of the time writing grants rather than doing research, for example.
Thank you for your talk, very interesting. Just at a very simplistic level, if American economy is on the decline, why does the American stock market continue to climb?
We'd like to ask Dawn about that. Can we can we get you up there for a bit? I have absolutely no idea, but I can't rationalize it, and so sometimes there is some herding behavior, and if you're the last one in there, so went well for all the other people I know, then I have to get in there as well. So I can't explain it in a different way, frankly.
We do have some questions online.
All right, yeah.
Your graphs focus on economic growth and GDP, but with the increased focus on degrowth, is there another way to measure technological progress without relying on growth?
So I think that there's clear natural resource constraints. They do exist. I don't want to diminish them. On a somewhat cheerful note, I would note that there's been a decoupling between economic growth and emissions in recent years, not just in places like Britain, also in China. And so if you don't want any growth, you basically don't want to improve material standards. The correlation between income and subjective well-being is something like 0.8. It's pretty strong, so income does have an impact on people's material well-being. And an economy that isn't growing eventually sort of becomes a zero-sum game, whereby the only way for me to improve my own standards of living is at the expense of somebody else. And that creates quite divisive politics, creates quite unpleasant dynamics in a society. And I do worry that the stagnation that we've seen in recent years may have contributed to where we are in terms of our politics as well.
Maybe you've addressed this, but you point out that in this age of computers, large organizations have scale and have advantages of scale. Whereas traditionally, often competition among smaller entities has led to innovation. Do you think that in this sort of new digital age, fewer larger organizations will yield more innovation, or do you think that larger organizations should be broken up in order to facilitate innovation? I think they should be broken up personally, but as a software developer, I'm aware that there is this problem of scale that you get in software, that there are advantages to, certain advantages to larger organizations. What do you think is better, big or small?
So I think you need both. So I think you need small for exploration, and I think you need big for scaling. And obviously in some cases, so DeepMind has clearly benefited from Google's compute. I'm not going to dispute that. What you don't want, though, is a few organizations that already have dominant technology blocking entry and blocking competition. And a key worry to me is that if you look at the early days of the computer revolution, basically every big firm from Apple and Microsoft to Google and Amazon, they IPO'd and became firms in their own right. And since the 2000s, we actually seen exits happening through acquisition rather than through firms becoming public. And so I don't know why that is exactly. It might have to do something with more rigorous reporting standards of being public firms. It might have to do with private capital markets being deeper. It's probably some combination of the two. It might also have to do with more laxer antitrust policy. And so what I think we should do is that we should try to tip that balance, because AI, in my view, will still require exploration to have progress. I'm not sure if the future of AI is large language models, if it's small language models, if it's reinforcement learning, if it's symbolic AI, if it's some combination of these things, if it's something else. I don't know.
So Carl, as I'm sure you know, if you look at scientific productivity, like what papers are most innovative, there are studies that show that over time, there are fewer and fewer really innovative single-authored papers. You need larger teams. There's speculation that's because the problems are getting more complex and harder to crack because they are more complex systems problems rather than simple reductionistic type problems. I'm just curious to hear your comment on that. Maybe even talk about it in your book, but I'm sure you've thought about it.
No, you're right. And so there are some papers associated with Ben Jones and others documenting, larger teams, and that being associated with greater advances in technology. Then there are other papers by my colleague Ling-Fei Wu and James Evans suggesting that smaller teams create more foundational technologies. And in my view, their work gets more to sort of breakthrough innovation. It correlates very well with Nobel Prizes and other things. And so I do believe their results. And that is not to say that collaborative innovation across disciplines is somehow bad. It's very hard. The Oxford Martin School was set up to tackle that particular challenge. And if you can create a few teams that do really breakthrough research in bridging those disciplines, that would be tremendously valuable. I'm not going to deny that. I do still think, though, that if you compare the EU to the United States, we spend basically as much as public R&D together as the US does. And I don't think we're getting the same results. And I think programs like Horizon 2020, for example, that build huge consortiums across different universities where people with very different incentives need to bond together somehow to show that they're a consortium, and then everybody does what they want to do otherwise, but they're spending a lot of time on making it look like the grant givers want it to look. I don't think that's a very productive system.
Thank you for your talk. You make an argument that technological progress isn't about geography or culture, it's about institutions. And you say that the institutions that are relevant here are bureaucracy and the competitive environment. And I was wondering what you would say shapes those institutions and to what degree policymakers can shape them.
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. So obviously, policymakers can shape them directly, right? So through Apollo, through the RAD Lab, through all these organizations, those had a very clear objectives. And I think, public policy often works best when you have a clear goal that you pursue and it keeps people accountable and there's a clear end to it, right? So Operation Warp Speed, I would throw in there as well as a successful program. And then you have, when it comes to exploration, I think universities are a key source of that, and I don't think that there is a plan B. And I think ARPA benefited enormously from the US decentralized system of universities. I think it's going to be very hard for another country to replicate that system because it doesn't have the same critical mass. And if you give people autonomy, then you better hire the best people. And so, if you're not monitoring performance, you want their incentives to be aligned, you want them to be extremely talented. And, that's what organizations like ARPA were set up to do and encourage, and what universities, I think, should do as well. When it comes to bureaucracy, so clearly there's a lot of things that government can do to reduce it in some domains, for example, and make it easier and less expensive to build. And so, in the UK, for example, I think John Milbauer would say that the Land Compensation Act of 61 gives landowners tremendous power, and that a lot of the uplift in land value when you build is captured by the landowner. And so that means that building becomes extremely expensive, and so you can change that. And then there's obviously a lot of well-intentioned occupational and environmental regulation that makes construction very expensive too. And it's a hard trade-off in many cases, because the people that usually benefit the most from public infrastructure are people at lower levels of income. And so there's a trade-off there that I think we need to think carefully about.
As you can tell, I'm about to draw the proceedings to a close, I'm afraid, with two invitations. The first is an invitation to an event exactly 4 weeks from today on the 12th of November. We are not in this room, but over in the Sheldonian Theatre, just across the road. It'll be the 20th James Martin Memorial Lecture, and William Hague, the Chancellor of the University, will be giving that. And it'll be titled Environment, Health, Society and Economics in the New Era of Geopolitics. So there's something for everyone in that. And second invitation is for right now. Carl will be signing books in the room next door. There are books for sale. There are also drinks. So you are very welcome, instead of heading left down to the street, to turn right and come and get a book and a drink. And perhaps we could just finish with a round of applause for Carl.